Good morning. Man, half the church leaves, don't they? That's a good thing. All right, guys. So, just to catch up on where we've been, if you haven't been here before, or maybe you've slept since last week, we've been going through the Bible and we've been talking about how the whole Bible is about Jesus Christ. It's either about the coming Messiah, the present Messiah, or the returning Messiah, because there's this thing going around in the church right now that says, well, maybe we only need the New Testament, and then there are people that say, well, maybe we only need the letters written in red, or maybe we only need Paul's letters to the church, and that's the only thing that's applicable to us. But in reality, if you don't understand that the whole Bible is all about Jesus, then you're missing out. All of those questions and things that you wonder about, why is the Bible this way, or why does God do this, or why is it that God chooses to do this? If you don't know the whole story and that it's all about Jesus, then you're missing out, and those questions can't get answered. And this morning we're in the book of Hosea. So if you start at all those big books and you end up and you have Daniel, the next book should be Hosea. It's the first one of those little books we call the minor prophets. Now we call them the minor prophets not because they're insignificant, but it's just because they aren't as long-winded as Ezekiel and some of the other major prophets, all right? Last week we talked about Amos. And Amos was a guy who talked a lot about judgment. Israel, the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel had been split. There had been a civil war. Solomon's son he wasn't Solomon. And the people did not appreciate his leadership at all. And so he split the nation. 10 tribes left, and they said, we're going to be the nation of Israel. You can be Judah and Benjamin down here, but we're going to leave and we're going to make the nation of Israel. And so what happens is they also leave the temple. And when they leave the temple, they're afraid that the rulers are afraid that the people will turn back to Jerusalem and they will fall back into the southern kingdom. So what they do is they set up their own worship and they bring in golden calves. You remember them from back in Exodus, the golden calf? If not, you can look it up right around the Ten Commandments. It's false worship. It's a symbol that they set up and they say, this is your God. This is the God of Israel. And what it really is they begin to bring in the pagan worship and mix it with the worship of God. There's a big word for that. If you want your nerd word of the week, it's syncretism. Yeah. You get 50 points redeemable at the next place that sells widgets if you remember that word next week. All right? Syncretism. What it means is we start to bring in other things from this world with the worship of God. We say we're worshiping God. We say we're worshiping the God of the Bible, but then we put these conditions on it, with these conditions that the world offers us, and we start to syncretize the world in its system or other religions with Christianity. You want a really protracted view of that? Think voodoo. All right? It's West African mysticism with a little bit of Christianity and some Catholicism and all kinds of stuff mixed in with it. And that's really syncretism gone off the rails, but we tend to do it a lot here. We can do it in various stages. We can make being a Christian mean that you have to dress a certain way, you have to talk a certain way, you have to sing certain songs, instead of making it about Jesus Christ and his redemption on the cross. And so Amos last week talked about what happens when the nation turns away and what it looks like for that punishment to come. Now, we did say at the last little bit of Amos that God shows his mercy. Because without justice, we said, can be no mercy. You can't be saved unless there's something to be saved from. So when we get to Hosea, you're going to see one of the strangest situations in the Bible. If you've never read Hosea, I want you to read the book this week. It's not terribly long. There's some chapters that are this long in Hosea. And there's also another little, here's your homework. In Hosea, it talks about dying and being raised on the third day. And who could he be talking about? That sounds familiar from somewhere. We're not going to get to that part today. However, that's your reason to go back and read Hosea. Look for Jesus in there. I promise you, it's in there. See if you can find it. If you do find it, go on the Facebook page and remark back to it, okay? That'll be cool. But what you see here, and before we get started, I want you to realize that what we're talking about now is not a theological statement on marriage, okay? I hear a lot of people who bring this up and they talk about this, and I've done it. We all make mistakes sometimes, but the more I studied this, the more I realized this is not a theological statement about marriage. This is, however, a theological statement about the goodness and the forgiveness and the grace and the mercy of God. Because God's mercy and love and grace is greater than you are capable of giving. His mercy and grace is greater sometimes than he expects out of you even. Because he knows that you can't be him. God is perfect, knows the heart, defines the heart. And he alone can offer the redemption that is required here when we see Hosea. All right? Now, that being said, I am always on the side of marriage. All right? I don't believe in the cheap, easy way out. But as we go to read this here in just a minute, you're going to go, okay, I guess I get it now. So in Hosea, starting in verse 2, it says, when the Lord first spoke to Hosea, he said this to him, go and marry a woman of promiscuity and have children of promiscuity, for the land is committing blatant acts of promiscuity by abandoning the Lord. This is a statement to Israel, all right? Keep in mind and keep in context here that he is addressing the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, it sometimes has been good. Sometimes they have been bad. They fluctuate back and forth. Ever since the northern kingdom was divided, they've been bad. They've been on the naughty list since day one, okay? They have never had a good king. They have never had a good priesthood. They have never had a good view of who God is, why they should serve God, or what the result of serving God would be. They have depended on foreign armies. They have depended on foreign gods. They've perverted the worship of God. And let me just bring this back in by saying that applies to us, because what he's talking about is an intimate relationship. And it seems kind of funny that God would tell Hosea the prophet, I want you to go marry a person who is not faithful to you before marriage, not faithful to you after marriage. He says, I want you to purposely go out and find a person to marry, find this woman to marry that I am going to designate, and she is going to be a lady of ill repute. A lady of the night, if you will. Okay? Are you picking up what I'm putting down here? She is not the lady that you want to bring home to mother. And if you're Hosea and you are a young man who is unmarried, who is serving God, you're probably going to go, can we talk about this for just a minute? Because I have this view of what I want my life to look like, and I have my view of what I want this close, intimate relationship that marriage is, and this is what I want it to look like. And God, this is really going to be taxing on me. It's really going to be hard on me if I choose a woman that is not what I'm looking for in a wife. can I tell you that the dating pool for God is very shallow? God wants to have an intimate relationship with a nation to take them and make them, at this point in time, and make them a light, a shining light on the hill to show his righteousness. Are there any righteous nations? No. Have there ever been any righteous nations? No. I don't care what your grandma said. It was just as bad when she was a kid as it is now. It's just getting worse, all right? Guys, when God sets out to establish a relationship, there is no one that he can establish a relationship with who has been faithful since day one. God only has sinners to work with. He is the only one who is righteous. And so Hosea here is very much experiencing what God is experiencing. God has set himself up by determining to have a relationship with us for heartache from the beginning. What's great is that he still chooses to have a relationship with us. Isn't that wonderful? I don't care who you are, what you look like, or what you have to offer. We are undesirable in the eyes of a perfect God if we were to stack up our virtues. God is holy and without sin, yet he chooses a bride. He chooses a church that from its very beginning, we were born sinners. Each and every member and part of the church was born a sinner. So Hosea is going to experience the same thing that God experiences. He is going to be a living example of what God is experiencing. And he says to him, have children. Have children. Now, can you imagine anything more painful than being in that relationship and seeing it grow unstable, neglected, unwanted, and multiply? That's what Hosea is going to experience. It says in verse 3, it says, so he went and married Gomer, daughter of Dibilam. Makes you wonder if at the altar the priest said, do you? And she said, golly, Shazam. Sorry, had to get that in there. If you do not watch Andy Griffith, I'm sorry. So he tells him, go marry Gomer, the daughter of Dibilam. And she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will bring bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu. Jehu is the dynasty. Jehu's long dead, but that is the dynasty that is ruling Israel right now. And put it into the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the Jezreel valley. Guys, in 722 BC, which is close, Hosea saw this. He lived this out. There is coming a day when the Assyrian army will destroy the nation of Israel. And to mention the Jezreel Valley to an Israelite would be to mention Chernobyl to a Russian. It would be to mention Columbine to an American. It is somewhere that there has been disaster and bloodshed tied to it. And for this nation, a very, very long time. There's been deceit, there's been assassination, there's been places of defeat and battle. Nothing good has come out of here. If you looked at it, it should be a beautiful valley that brought joy, but nothing good is coming out of this place. And for him to name his son, his firstborn son, Jezreel, meaning destruction is coming on the country, That would get people's attention. Come here, destruction, I need you to say, no, sit down. How would that feel? And as bad as that is, it says in Hosea verse 1, verse 6, it says, she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Now I want you to contrast something. In verse 4, or in verse 3, it says, she conceived and bore him, meaning Hosea, a son. But when we get in verse 6, it says, she, being Gomer, conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. It doesn't say she bore to him. It says she conceived and bore to him a daughter, and the Lord said to him, her name is Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, and I will certainly take them away. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and I will deliver them by the Lord their God, and not deliver them by the bow or the sword or war or by horses or by cavalry. Can you imagine? I've had a little baby girl. Anybody had a little baby girl? Held them in their arms? Yeah, she's smiling at me now. And there's something about looking at a little baby girl, and when you look at her, they're so sweet. And can you imagine naming that child No Compassion? I have no compassion. Come here, No Compassion. She's not Hosea's child. The first son says that she bore to him. Now it says she just bore a child. And calls that child No Compassion. That child is not his. He, however, brings it into his house. And he says this is what's happened. You see, in the nation of Israel at this point in time, when this child is born, they have not leaned on God. They instead, unlike the nation of Judah, which when times got hard, the Assyrians will gather on Judah as well at the same time. And they will have a king named Hezekiah, and Hezekiah will do a lot of good things, and he's a good godly king, and he will stave off the Assyrians. And he will do it through faith in God. But what happens is the Israelites will hire out armies. They will put their strength in Egypt. They'll hire mercenaries from lands around them and say, we're going to put our strength in these other armies, in these mercenaries, and that's where we're going to look for our strength and not our strength in God. And as a result, God says, you have stepped out on me, nation of Israel. You've gone somewhere without me. You've went out and you've looked for lovers in these armies. The same way that Hosea's wife has. And because of this, I'm not going to have any compassion on the results that you've brought upon yourself. I've asked you when times get hard, when things are lean, come to me and I will help you. But instead, you turned to somewhere else for compassion and comfort. That's kind of harsh, right? Can you imagine naming a little baby girl No Compassion? But it's all because there's been unfaithfulness in the family. Because instead of turning and looking for the place of comfort where she should have, Gomer stepped outside of her relationship. And the nation of Israel has stepped outside of her relationship. And we do that too, right? Like when things get going hard and times are tough, people start turning to other things. We have an epidemic in the nation. People will turn looking for joy to substances and to sex and to all these places that God never intended them. And they start looking for things. They start looking for comfort. We all start looking for comfort, sometimes when times are good and sometimes when times are bad outside of the bounds of our relationship with God. And then what do? When we mess up, we want God to have compassion on that. Fix it. I'm in a mess. Fix it. But God says, he tells Israel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you experience what you have sown. Now, guys, I know I told you that this week was going to be about the compassion of God, and I promise you we're getting there. But right now, what we're experiencing is life. All right? Keep that in mind. What we're experiencing now in the book of Hosea is what the reaping what we have chosen in our lives. And so in verse 8 and 9 it says, after Gomer weaned Lo Ruhamah, y'all try to pronounce these. She conceived and gave birth to a son. Once again, does not say she gave Hosea a son. It says she conceived and gave birth to a son. And then the Lord said, name him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people and I will not be your God. Another child whose paternity is in question. I read somewhere where it said it was an illegitimate child. I don't think any child is illegitimate. All right. But the paternity of this child is also in question. She has turned so far away. Gomer has turned so far away from her wedding vows that she has disregarded Hosea and her covenant with him completely, to the point where he has had to say, this is not my family. This is not my family. And guys, she's gone. Gomer's gone. She's went from bad to worse. She wasn't great to start with, and she's went to worse. How many of us here, God makes us an offer of salvation? And it seems great at first, right? You're going to take me in? I'm a sinner. You're going to take me in? You're going to love me? You're going to have compassion on me? And we start looking at that relationship and we start taking it for granted. We become unfaithful. We have this, in America, we have this thing called FOMO, the fear of missing out. And we start looking at what's going on outside in the world. And we start thinking, it's okay because I'm in this relationship with God. He'll understand. He doesn't want me to miss out on these things, right? He wants me to be happy, right? And so we start stepping out. And we start doing things in our lives that sadden God. And then we'll come home and we bring the fruit of our sin with us. And for a little bit we try to live at home again. And then we start fearing missing out and we turn away again. Guys, at this point, how do you think God feels in his heart looking at us? Looking at the nation of Israel, knowing, as he said when the first child was born, that they are headed down the wrong path. They're headed towards destruction. Do you think God is enjoying all this? Do you think he's looking at it, laughing, rubbing his hands, waiting to send fire bolts down? No. If you are watching Hosea, this is easy for us to read. We get like that Old Testament vibe and stuff. But if you were watching Hosea live out his life, if it was your friend that you were watching, that you lived with, that you did life with every day, and you saw him suffering through this, and you saw him, and his wife is not who you're like, dude, you shouldn't marry her. But he does anyway, and he loves her, and he gives everything he has to her, and he devotes his life to her. And all of a sudden, things start going bad, and they have a child, but they're headed down a rocky road, and then there's another child, and it's not his. And he says, this is going down the wrong way. but he keeps her. And once again, they have another child. Can you imagine seeing your friend? What would he or her look like when after this second, third child's born? Can you imagine what their life is like, where they're at emotionally, where they're at physically, how it's affected them? God told Hosea to live this out so the people would look and go, this is how I feel. My heart is destroyed. And Gomer has left him. You can say, I thought you said this is all going to be about compassion. In Hosea 1, verse 10, it says, yet the number of the Israelites will be like the sands of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted. And in the place where they were told, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. And the Judeans and the Israelites will be gathered together, and they will be appointed for themselves a single ruler to go up from the land. For the day of Jezreel will be great. Do you get that? Not my people will be my people. And this promise that God gives them, the Israelites will be like the sand of the sea, he reaches way back to Genesis. And he goes, do you remember the vow that we made? Do you remember that wedding vow that we made? That I told Abraham that you will be mine and that your descendants will be like the sands of the sea. God looks and says, I remember my vows. Though all this stuff that you've done and everything that's going on, I remember my vows. And if you go home and read chapter 3, at this point in time, in chapter 3, Gomer has went back to prostitution, and she has gotten so used up by the world that she is now on auction at a slave block. She has sold herself into the slavery of sin. Can you imagine being Hosea and walking down through the slave market and seeing your wife for sale? And at this point in time, in chapter 2, it describes this woman, this unfaithful spouse, who has been wanted by the world as long as she is young and she is attractive and she has something to offer. And guess what? When the reason that she is young and she's attractive and she has something to offer, the scripture points out, is that because God has made her beautiful. How many of you gentlemen, when you look back at your wedding photos or prior to being married, you look back and you go, man, I was scruffy and had like stuff in my eyes, and my wife got me and cleaned me up and polished me up and made me somebody worth having? That's me. I tell everybody, when me and Becky got married, her daddy's a preacher. And I was not what the pastor was looking for in a son-in-law. And she took me home, scrubbed me up, cleaned me up, and put me on the shelf. Made me look like somebody, her and Jesus. The reason this woman has been desirable is because of all the gifts that God has given her. He says that she was giving away all of her oil and her wines and all of her grain to these foreign gods, when really all of them had been given to her by her husband, by God. We are offering the things that God has given us up to the world, when really what God wants in a relationship is for us to give them back to Him. And guys, in Hosea chapter 2, you're going to see something. Starting in verse 7 and 8, it says, she will pursue her lovers but not catch them. She will look for them but not find them. And she will think, I will go back to my former husband, for then it was better for me than now. And she does not recognize that it is I who gave her the grain and the new wine and the gold on which they used for Baal, the foreign god that she offered to him. The great theologians, the Dixie Chicks, sang this line. And I swear I've thought about this a million times and thought this would be an awesome song to sing to Christ. He said, I've been too long in the wind and too long in the rain, taking any comfort that I can, looking back and longing for the freedom of my chains and lying in your loving arms again. And that's where Gomer is right now. Her life's a mess. Hosea buys her back for 15 pieces of silver and a bag of grain. The world says her life is not worth anything anymore, but Hosea says, this is my wife and I am purchasing her. In chapter 2, 14 and 15, it says, therefore, I'm going to persuade her, lead her to the wilderness, and speak to her tenderly. That's where the relationship between Israel and God began, was in the wilderness. Can you imagine being that unfaithful spouse and your loved one coming to you when you're in the depths of your loss and your depravity and going, sweetheart, please, let's go back where it all started. It says he spoke tenderly towards her. He spoke love and devotion to her that did not show him love or devotion. He said, come back, darling. Come back, honey. Come back to where it all started. Let's renew our love. Let's make it just like it was in the beginning. And let's forget everything else. And he said, therefore, I will give her vineyards back to her and make her the valley of Anchor into a gateway of hope. And she will respond as she did in the days of your youth, in the days that she came out of the land of Egypt. Not you have to pay for this. Not you have to do something. He says, come back. Come back home. It'll be just like it was in the beginning. I've paid for it all. And her heart responds to that. See, he says she's going to see me as her husband again. He said, in that day, this is the Lord's declaration, you will call me my husband, and no longer call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they will no longer be remembered in their names. This is the great part about it, guys, because she's been out where she was, she knows how good it is at home now. Is there anything better than being forgiven when you shouldn't be forgiven? Is there anything that's greater than knowing that you are loved when you don't deserve love, when you've been unfaithful, when you've done everything and given it all away, that you can come home and be loved just like it never happened because it's all been paid for? Guys, we've all been unfaithful. Some of us have never been in a relationship with Christ. He's been asking us to come home. But we've been struggling out there with things that the world tells us will make us happy. And sooner or later, we'll come to the end of ourselves and we're going to find out that all that the world says that they have to offer us are just things that God has given us that they're taking away. Let's bow our heads.